Hollywood's brightest stars, once adored for their beauty, charisma, and unforgettable screen presence, captivated us like few others could. But behind the glamour and flashing cameras lies a darker truth. These 12 beloved celebrities made decisions they thought would preserve their fame, only to end up altering their faces and their futures forever. Driven by the brutal demands of the industry and a relentless obsession with perfection, they turned to cosmetic surgery. The result? Drastic transformations that left some unrecognizable, others blacklisted, and many devastated. What you're about to see isn't just a list of botched procedures. It's a haunting journey through fame, identity, and the painful price of chasing youth in a town that worships beauty. We're peeling back the gloss and exposing the heartbreak behind the headlines. And trust me, number 7? That one shocked even the most jaded Hollywood insiders into stunned silence. Burt Reynolds was the king of the 1970s, a box office titan with a swagger, that legendary mustache, and a smile that made hearts race around the world. He wasn't just a movie star, he was a symbol of rugged American masculinity. But by the 1980s, a series of cosmetic procedures slowly chipped away at the very image that made him iconic, and with it, his place in Hollywood's spotlight. It began innocently. Years of doing his own stunts had left Reynolds battered. An on-set injury from a metal chair shattered his jaw, and old football wounds never quite healed. The early surgeries were necessary and subtle, meant to repair, not reinvent. But as he entered his 50s, Reynolds took a turn toward more drastic enhancements. The most damaging? An aggressive eyelid lift that permanently altered his gaze. The heavy-lidded, smoldering look that once captivated millions was replaced with a wide-eyed, almost startled expression. The magic in his stare, the kind that could light up a scene without a word, was gone. Not long after, he underwent a lower facelift that reshaped his strong jawline, once a defining feature of his masculinity. Directors who had worked with him for years now struggled to capture that same on-screen magnetism. By the time Evening Shade premiered in 1990, fans were shocked. The weathered, natural handsomeness they remembered had been replaced by a taut, shiny appearance and unnaturally arched brows that robbed his face of expression. In his later years, Reynolds didn't shy away from the truth. "I should never have had the surgery," he admitted in his memoir. "That expression, that was my identity." Once it changed, something essential was gone. Casting directors who once built films around his presence now saw a man whose face no longer matched the legend they remembered. His charm hadn't vanished, but it was trapped beneath the surface of a face that no longer moved the same. By the early 90s, leading roles were rare, and Reynolds found himself relegated to supporting parts. Yet his talent never faded. His Oscar-nominated performance in Boogie Nights, 1997, reminded the world that the soul of a great actor still burned bright beneath the scars of surgical regret. What makes Burt Reynolds' story so poignant is that his downfall wasn't from scandal or failure. It was from a desire to hold onto the image that had once defined a generation. Later in life, he became a vocal critic of Hollywood's obsession with youth. "They should put my picture next to the word mistake in the dictionary," he said. "Aging isn't for cowards, but trying too hard to stay young? That's just foolish." Doris Day once lit up the screen with her sunny smile, golden voice, and wholesome beauty that made her America's sweetheart. Her charm was effortless, her presence comforting, a symbol of innocence and joy in a changing world. But as the years passed and Hollywood's obsession with youth intensified, that same spotlight began to cast shadows. The pressure to stay forever young slowly pushed Doris toward choices that would later contribute to her quiet retreat from fame. Unlike many of her peers, Doris didn't rush into cosmetic procedures. She waited until her 40s, embracing her age with grace. Her first tweaks were subtle, barely noticeable. But by the late 1960s, as she filmed with Six You Get Egg Roll, the industry's expectations were relentless. To maintain her image as the eternal girl next door, she underwent a light facelift and some work around her eyes. These early changes were tasteful, preserving much of the warmth and expressiveness that made her so beloved. Then came the 1970s, and with it, more dramatic alterations. As she geared up for the Doris Day show, Doris chose a more aggressive facelift, along with dental veneers and changes to her lips. The result? Her once naturally animated features grew noticeably tighter. Her radiant smile, once full of feeling, started to look fixed. Cinematographers who had worked with her for years suddenly found it hard to capture her magic. The light in her eyes, those famously expressive windows into her soul, dimmed behind skin pulled too taut. By the final seasons of her show, even the lighting crew struggled to work around the sheen of her stretched skin, which reflected studio lights unnaturally. Fans, too, began to notice. Her once open and expressive face had become harder to read, less like Doris Day, and more like a version of her that had been frozen in time. Though she never publicly addressed the surgeries, those closest to her knew the toll they had taken. Doris became more self-conscious, aware that something had been lost. The cameras no longer captured the same spark, the same sincerity that once defined her. And perhaps most heartbreaking of all, in trying to preserve her youthful glow, she had unintentionally dimmed the very authenticity that had made her shine. In the years that followed, Doris withdrew almost entirely from the spotlight. She declined interviews, avoided cameras, and rarely made public appearances, except when championing her deep passion for animal welfare. When she did appear, fans were often struck by how different she looked from the woman who had once charmed the world with a single smile. Her story isn't just about beauty or aging, it's about the cruel cost of an industry that doesn't let its icons grow old with dignity. And for Doris Day, a woman who had built her legacy on sincerity, the ultimate irony was that in trying to hold onto the image the world adored, she lost the very thing that made it real. Elizabeth Taylor, the woman with the legendary violet eyes and a beauty that seemed almost mythical, was once hailed as the epitome of Hollywood glamour. Her face, flawless and unforgettable, became a symbol of cinematic perfection across the globe. But in the years that followed her prime, the very features that made her an icon began to change, forever altered by the pressures of fame, time, and ultimately, surgery. Unlike many of her peers, Taylor resisted cosmetic enhancements well into her 40s, proudly carrying her natural allure into middle age. But by the 1980s, as she entered her 50s, she began a series of increasingly aggressive procedures. The turning point came with a dramatic facelift in the mid-80s, a choice that redefined her most famous feature, her eyes. Once almond-shaped and feline, her gaze became rounder, less mysterious. Her eyebrows were lifted so high they seemed frozen in surprise, and her eyes, once capable of speaking volumes without a word, lost their signature magic. Subsequent work on her jawline and neck created a look that felt too taut, too polished. Cinematographers who once marveled at the natural softness of her features suddenly found themselves struggling with harsh reflections and unnatural contours. Lighting her became a technical challenge. But worse than the physical changes was what they cost her as an actress. Gone was the subtle, soul-bearing expressiveness that defined her role in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. The delicate tremble of a lip, the quiet heartbreak in a glance. In its place was a face that no longer moved with the same emotional depth. It wasn't just her appearance that had been altered, it was her ability to connect, to move us. By the 1990s, the transformation was so stark that younger generations barely recognized the Cleopatra of their parents' era. Her final roles were limited not only by health but by the constraints of her appearance, an appearance that no longer reflected the raw, emotional powerhouse she once was. Mike Nichols, the director who helped her deliver one of the greatest performances in film history, later confessed that he had considered casting her again, but realized, with a heavy heart, that the Elizabeth he had once known was gone. The surgeries had done more than tighten skin. They had stripped away her greatest artistic tool. What makes Taylor's story especially tragic is that she once spoke out fiercely against Hollywood's obsession with youth. In interviews during the 1970s, she championed the beauty of age, declaring that character was far more compelling than perfection. Yet in the end, even she became a casualty of the very system she tried to defy. Gary Cooper was the living embodiment of quiet, rugged American masculinity. With his weathered face, soulful eyes, and unshakable presence, he didn't just play heroes, he became them. From High Noon to Sergeant York, Cooper brought a raw, understated authenticity to every role he touched. But as time crept in and Hollywood clung to youth, the very features that made him iconic began to fade, not with age, but under the surgeon's knife. In the mid-1950s, nearing his 60s yet still cast opposite much younger actresses, Cooper made a fateful choice. His first forays into plastic surgery were modest, tightening the skin around his eyes and neck to keep his signature look intact. But by 1957, the changes became harder to ignore. A major facelift wiped away the deep lines and rugged edges that had once told the story of a life fully lived. What remained was a smoother, oddly unfamiliar face, a version of Gary Cooper that even longtime fans struggled to recognize. The most devastating change? His eyes. Cooper's heavy-lidded, thoughtful gaze had always said more than any line of dialogue. But after a drastic eye lift, that gaze was gone, replaced by a taut, wide-eyed look that lacked the soul directors had long depended on. Even Fred Zinnemann, who had guided Cooper to an Oscar in High Noon, confessed to having trouble directing him in later projects. The man who once wore the weight of the world across his brow now appeared eerily untouched by it. By the time he starred in The Naked Edge in 1961, critics began to take notice. Something was missing. The emotional nuance, the subtle expressions, the quiet power, dulled, even frozen. What they didn't know was that Cooper physically couldn't express those emotions anymore. The surgery had stripped away not just the lines of age, but the tools of his craft. And therein lay the cruelest irony. Gary Cooper's strength had never been in youth. It was in authenticity. The creases in his skin, the grit in his eyes, they were the very things that made him magnetic. In trying to hold on to youth, he'd erased the face audiences had come to trust. In later years, Cooper privately confided in his close friend, Ernest Hemingway. He admitted that when he looked in the mirror, or watched himself on screen, he didn't recognize the man staring back. Hemingway, always a champion of scars and stories, simply told him, "The lines in a man's face are where he's been and what he's seen." Why would you erase your own story? Joan Crawford's place in Hollywood history is legendary. Her fierce talent and unforgettable screen presence made her one of the most iconic stars of the silver screen. From the dazzling breakout role in Our Dancing Daughters to her Oscar-winning performance in Mildred Pierce, Crawford wasn't just a movie star, she was a force of nature. But as time marched on and Hollywood's obsession with youth grew more ruthless, Crawford found herself in a quiet war against aging, and ultimately, against herself. Her journey with plastic surgery began in her 40s, starting with subtle tweaks like a neck lift and minor eye work. At first, the changes seemed harmless, even helpful. But by the time she reached her 50s, the procedures became more frequent and more extreme. By the 1960s, the once expressive face that had captivated millions was now unnaturally tight, frozen into a mask that no longer reflected the depth of her soul. Perhaps the most heartbreaking change was to her eyebrows, those bold, sculpted arches that had become her signature since the 1930s. Repeated brow lifts distorted them into an exaggerated curve, leaving her with a constant look of surprise or irritation. What was once a symbol of power and allure now betrayed her, limiting her emotional range and robbing her performances of subtlety. Directors who once clamored to work with her began to struggle. Harsh lighting cast eerie shadows across her taut features, and no amount of makeup could restore what surgery had taken. Worse still, the tightness in her face made it difficult for her to move, making it almost impossible to deliver the nuanced performances that had once made her a star. By the time she appeared in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane? In 1962, audiences were stunned, not just by the haunting character she played, but by how much Joan herself had changed. Director Robert Aldrich later confessed he had to strategically position the camera to hide the effects of her surgeries. The tragedy wasn't just in her appearance, it was in the way her natural brilliance had been muted by the very industry that once celebrated her. In her final major film, Straitjacket, 1964, Crawford gave it everything she had, but critics noted something was off. Her performance felt stiff, limited. They blamed her acting. What they didn't realize was that Joan Crawford was still there, still feeling, still fighting to be seen. But her face could no longer keep up with her heart. John Wayne, the rugged face of the American cowboy and a titan of Hollywood legend, might seem like the last person you'd expect to go under the knife. But even the Duke wasn't immune to the relentless pressure of staying youthful in an industry obsessed with appearances. As he pushed into his 50s, still cast as heroic leads opposite actresses half his age, Wayne quietly turned to cosmetic surgery to maintain his on-screen vitality. It started subtly in the late 1950s. A bit of neck tightening, a touch-up around the eyelids. Nothing drastic, just enough to preserve that weathered charm without looking artificial. But by the mid-1960s, the procedures became more aggressive. A lower facelift significantly redefined his iconic jawline, the very one that had become a trademark of his stoic, commanding screen presence. Suddenly, directors and lighting crews who had worked with Wayne for decades found themselves struggling. The tautness in his jaw and neck was hard to hide, and by the time True Grit rolled around in 1968, the changes were impossible to ignore. His signature squint, once effortless and gritty, now looked strained, a forced echo of the man audiences once knew. Even legendary director Howard Hawks, who had shaped so many of Wayne's iconic roles, quietly lamented the loss of Wayne's natural ruggedness. In their final collaboration, Hawks relied on creative lighting tricks to bring back the texture and realism that surgery had stripped away. In the twilight of his career, critics who once praised Wayne's stoic grace began to accuse him of stiffness and emotional detachment. What they didn't see was the deeper truth. The very surgeries meant to preserve his image had robbed him of the facial nuance that made him a great actor. His expressions were no longer his own. In private moments, Wayne confided in his son Patrick, admitting the regret that haunted him. The surgeries, he said, didn't just change how he looked. They changed who he was, at least, to the audience watching on the other side of the screen. Judy Garland's tragic transformation didn't begin with fame, it began with force. Unlike others on this list, her story isn't just about cosmetic changes, it's about how a young girl's body was hijacked by Hollywood before she even knew who she was. At just 16, Garland wasn't praised for her voice or raw talent. She was told she wasn't pretty enough. MGM studio head Louis B. Mayer declared her nose too wide, her teeth too imperfect. So, without her full understanding or true consent, Judy was pushed into a rhinoplasty that would forever alter her face and her sense of self. But the surgery was only the beginning. To enhance her new features, studio doctors gave her removable dental caps and painful rubber inserts to reshape her jaw, devices she had to wear during grueling shooting days. Worse still were the weekly sessions where doctors would manually press on her nose cartilage, reshaping it without additional surgery but with excruciating pain. None of this was done out of care, it was about control. These relentless modifications fed into a storm of insecurity, anxiety, and eventual addiction. By the time she starred in A Star Is Born in 1954, Garland's face had undergone multiple procedures, all decisions made for her, not by her. Directors began to notice something tragic. The magic of her expressions, that natural emotional glow from The Wizard of Oz, was fading. George Cukor, who directed A Star Is Born, even admitted that close-ups became difficult. Something real had disappeared, he said. And that was the real heartbreak. Garland was never given the chance to embrace who she was. Instead, the studio told her from girlhood that her real face, her real self, wasn't good enough. In one of her final interviews, she said it best, "They squashed my nose. They straightened my teeth. They told me to lose weight. And then they told me I still wasn't good enough." The very procedures meant to preserve her career ended up helping to destroy it. Not because she wasn't talented enough, but because they made her believe she never was. Marilyn Monroe, she wasn't just a Hollywood icon, she was Hollywood. With her platinum curls, hypnotic gaze, and that unforgettable beauty mark, she became the very symbol of glamour and desire. But behind the flawless image was a deeper, more troubling story, one few truly know. Long before she became the legend, young Norma Jean was persuaded to make minor changes to her appearance. Under pressure from early managers, she underwent a subtle chin implant and a nose refinement, small steps that marked the beginning of a slow, painful transformation. What started as gentle tweaks evolved into something far more consuming. As her fame skyrocketed, so did the industry's demands. By the late 1950s, Marilyn was regularly receiving collagen injections in her lips and cheeks. Those closest to her began to notice. Her once soft features were becoming swollen, her expressions stiffer, less alive. Film historians often point to The Misfits as a turning point, the movie where her face, once so full of emotion, began to look frozen, as if something essential had been lost. And by her final photo shoots, the heartbreak was undeniable. Makeup artists struggled to recreate the look that had once enchanted the world. Subtle but irreversible changes had altered the architecture of her face. The very tools that once enhanced her beauty were now dimming the spark that made her unforgettable. Watch Some Like It Hot and then her final roles. You can see it. The difference in her expressions, the fading magic in her eyes. It's one of Hollywood's most tragic ironies. In trying to preserve her perfection, the system chipped away at what made her truly extraordinary. We'll never know how many unforgettable roles Marilyn might have delivered if her natural beauty and the emotions it carried had been left untouched. Mary Pickford, America's first true sweetheart, captivated the world with her golden curls, innocent smile, and timeless charm. She ruled the silent film era like royalty, becoming the face of purity and youth in Hollywood's earliest days. But fame, as always, has a price. As the years passed and sound entered the world of cinema, so did a new kind of pressure, the kind that whispers that youth is everything, especially for women in the spotlight. Pickford had built her legacy playing girls far younger than her actual age. So, when she entered her 30s in the late 1920s, the pressure to preserve that childlike image became overwhelming. At first, the changes were subtle, an eyelid lift here, a little contouring there, just enough to keep the illusion alive. But Hollywood doesn't let its darlings age gently. By the mid-1930s, Mary became consumed with maintaining the youthful face that had once lit up silent screens. With each new procedure, her expressions grew tighter, less natural, until the very magic that made her a star began to fade. The breaking point came in 1939. Hoping to make a comeback, Pickford underwent a drastic facelift that left her with a permanently startled look. Her face, once capable of conveying 1,000 emotions without a single word, was now frozen, emotionless. When she watched her own test footage, the devastation was immediate. She reportedly broke down, realizing she could no longer be the Mary the world once adored. Rather than continue in a diminished light, Pickford chose silence, this time not on screen, but in life. She retreated into seclusion at her grand estate, Pickfair, rarely allowing herself to be seen. Those who did catch a glimpse described her appearance as haunting, a face locked in a youthful mask that only highlighted the passage of time. By the end of her life, the woman who once defined an era had all but vanished from public view. When she received her Academy Honorary Award in 1976, she didn't attend the ceremony. She accepted it from home, hidden from the very spotlight that once made her shine. Mickey Rourke's story is one of Hollywood's most haunting transformations, from heartthrob to unrecognizable. In the 1980s, Rourke was a rising force, smoldering, magnetic, and undeniably talented. With films like Diner and 9.5 Weeks, he wasn't just another pretty face. He had that rare blend of raw edge and real acting chops. His piercing eyes and rugged appeal made him a fixture on movie posters and a favorite with audiences. But then, everything changed. In the early 90s, Rourke made a bold and risky decision. He stepped away from Hollywood to return to professional boxing, a sport he had loved in his youth. But the ring wasn't kind. Multiple broken noses, shattered cheekbones, and a torn tongue left his once golden face battered and bruised. And instead of letting time heal the damage, Rourke turned to cosmetic surgery, again and again. What followed was a devastating series of botched procedures. His nose, once strong and defined, was left overly smooth and tight. His cheekbones were reconstructed in a way that gave him a constantly startled appearance. But the most heartbreaking change? His eyes. That intense, soulful gaze, the very thing that once lit up the screen, was all but erased. By the late 90s, Rourke no longer resembled the star who once held Hollywood in the palm of his hand. Casting directors stopped calling. Major roles dried up. The very look that had made him a leading man had vanished. For nearly a decade, he was relegated to small roles in forgettable, low-budget films. It wasn't until 2005's Sin City, where heavy makeup and prosthetics hid his altered appearance, that Rourke made a small comeback. Then in 2008, The Wrestler gave him a shot at redemption and earned him an Oscar nomination. Still, many in the industry whispered the same sad truth. Had it not been for the surgeries, Mickey Rourke might have had a career filled with golden statues, not regrets. Tony Curtis was once the epitome of Hollywood charm, his chiseled features and magnetic smile earning him comparisons to a young Cary Grant. In classics like Some Like It Hot and The Defiant Ones, he lit up the screen, not just with looks but with undeniable talent. But as the years passed, Curtis, like so many in Hollywood, feared the cruel erosion of youth. And in his quest to hold on to the face that made him a star, he made choices that ultimately cost him more than he could imagine. His journey with plastic surgery began in the mid-1960s. He was in his 40s but still playing heartthrobs. The early tweaks were subtle, an eye lift here, a little tightening along the jawline. Nothing too drastic, just enough to stay in the game. But by the 1970s, things took a turn. Curtis opted for more aggressive procedures, including a major facelift that erased the lines of time, but also stripped away the warmth and nuance of his expressions. The change didn't go unnoticed. Directors who once praised his emotive face now found themselves struggling to work around a stiff, mask-like visage. The sparkle in his eyes, the very thing that once drew audiences in, was dulled by tightened skin that robbed him of subtle emotional range. Even Some Like It Hot director Billy Wilder, who helped shape Curtis's legacy, lamented, "Tony's face doesn't move the way it used to, and in this business, that's a problem." By the late 70s, the consequences of those surgeries were unavoidable. Once offered complex, leading man roles, Curtis began appearing in forgettable guest spots and low-budget films, his star power dimmed by the physical transformation he could no longer hide. In rare moments of vulnerability during interviews in the 1980s, Curtis confessed his regret. "I went too far trying to stay young," he admitted. "There's a line you don't come back from, and I crossed it." He especially mourned the changes to his eyes and mouth, saying, "Those were my tools. I tampered with the very things I needed to act." Perhaps the most heartbreaking reflection came from his Some Like It Hot co-star, Jack Lemmon, who once said, "Tony was one of the most naturally expressive actors I ever worked with. But after all the work, some of that spontaneity was gone. It was like watching someone try to act through a mask." The tragedy wasn't that Tony Curtis lost his talent. He didn't. His performance in the 1989 indie film Midnight proved that. The brilliance was still there, burning beneath the surface. But the Hollywood leading man he once was, the one whose face captured hearts and sold tickets, had vanished. All because of one irreversible truth. In trying to preserve his image, he lost the very thing that made it unforgettable. Montgomery Clift's story may be the most heartbreaking example of how trauma, surgery, and a brilliant career can collide in the cruelest way. Before 1956, Clift was the golden boy of Hollywood, hailed not only for his chiseled beauty but for the raw emotional power he brought to the screen. In films like A Place in the Sun and From Here to Eternity, he redefined masculinity, showing that strength could coexist with sensitivity. He wasn't just a handsome face, he was a force of talent, destined for greatness. But then, tragedy struck. After leaving a dinner party at Elizabeth Taylor's home, Clift crashed his car into a telephone pole, an accident that would permanently alter his life and legacy. His injuries were horrific. A broken nose, a shattered jaw, and facial nerve damage that left one side of his face partially paralyzed. Elizabeth Taylor reportedly rushed to the scene and saved his life, pulling shattered teeth from his throat so he wouldn't choke. The reconstructive surgeries that followed were grueling and, given the medical limitations of the 1950s, only partially successful. Clift's once symmetrical, expressive face would never be the same. When he returned to filming Raintree County, the difference was unmistakable. Directors could only shoot him from certain angles. His famous emotional range, once visible in every micro-expression, was now hindered by immobility on one side of his face. Still, Clift adapted. With sheer will and unmatched skill, he relearned how to perform. And in Judgment at Nuremberg, he earned an Oscar nomination, proving his talent went far beyond his looks. But behind the camera, the toll was immense. The roles grew fewer, the pressures heavier. Struggling with pain and disillusionment, Clift turned to alcohol and pills. Once praised as one of Hollywood's finest, he became difficult to direct, difficult to frame. His final film, The Defector, showed glimpses of his old brilliance, but also the weight of years spent battling both physical and emotional pain. What makes Montgomery Clift's story so unique is that his surgeries weren't cosmetic, they were a matter of survival. And yet, the impact on his career was devastating. The face that once launched his stardom had changed, and in an industry obsessed with appearance, that change cost him everything. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. We'll see you in the next one.